Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. Well, in history, there are certain dates that all historians must know, and one such day is October the 31st, 1517. On this day in history, a lowly German monk took a series of arguments he'd made against the practices of the ruling church and nailed them to a church door in Wittenberg, Germany. This may not seem like much and might seem kind of weird, but this bold act of defiance would kickstart perhaps the most important religious movement in the Western world, where thousands would rediscover the truth of the gospel of Jesus. Let's explore this event of tantamount importance in the history of the church from October the 31st, 1517. On this date in the Roman Catholic calendar was actually a day of great importance as well. It was All Hallows Eve. It was the day before All Saints' Day, where the church would pay fealty and in many cases even pray to departed saints. Now, in the late medieval European academic sphere, it would have been customary for those wishing to engage in healthy debate to post their argument in a public place for all to see. In Wittenberg, Germany in the early 16th century, that place was the castle church door. It was a medieval version of a social media feed in many ways. Well, enter Martin Luther, a 16th century German monk who had for years wrestled with the reality of his own sin in the presence of God's justice. The Lord had opened Luther's eyes to the true gospel of grace as he was studying Romans 1 in the Augustinian monastery, where Luther saw how God does not treat us as our sins deserve, but counts us as righteous for the sake of Christ. This contrasted the teaching of the church, which said good works were necessary, at least in part, to be made righteous before God. This intense studying also revealed to Luther some of the serious problems that were plaguing the church at the time, the most serious of which perhaps was the sale of indulgences. The church sold these righteousness contracts, as they were, with the promise of granting years or centuries off of time in purgatory, with the funds going to the lavish rebuild of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. Well, Luther was incensed to see his beloved flock being swayed by the indulgence salesman, the chief of whom was the notorious John Tetzel. So he decided to act. He wrote down 95 arguments in an effort to bring to light to the church what was happening. Now, Luther had no intention of fracturing the church. He assumed Tetzel was acting out of the Pope's control and merely wanted to bring light to the situation. So on October 31st, Luther posted these 95 theses on the castle church door at Wittenberg. But Luther miscalculated several things. First, he was unaware that the indulgence salesmen were actually sanctioned by the Pope himself and supported by the church, both in doctrine and in finances. And second, he did not realize the impact he would have thanks to some of his eager young students who loved his work and wanted the message to get across. So with the newly invented printing press, Luther's theses spread all across Europe and made it to the throne of St. Peter, catching the attention of Pope Leo X. Luther's world and the world as a whole would never be the same again thanks to what he did on October the 31st. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History.